lecture. This is one of my favorites. It's language and identity, focusing on ethnicity. So when we talk about ethnicity, this is kind of a very controversial term in that a lot of people associate with race, a lot of people associate with cultural background. This is linguistic of ethnicity is something a little bit more broadly. So we feel like ethnicity is shares a common understanding, right? If we say something is ethnic, we that would denote, especially in America, that something's a minority. So we wouldn't say like, yeah, like I'll take you out to this ethnic restaurant. They serve hot dogs and apple pie, right? That's not really something that we would consider to be ethnic. So the term ethnicity has really been a charged term in the United States because, similar to our last lecture on marked language, ethnicity is something that's marked. We normally think of someone of an ethnic background as someone other than being a white American. And so, major groups rarely define themselves as being a part of an ethnic group. But we would really say that ethnicity, in a linguistic sense, is very objective. It's based on actual measurable things. So, for example, someone's language can make up their ethnicity, someone's geography, their religion, a shared ancestry. We would also say that ethnicity, is non voluntary. That means that you don't sign up to be an ethnicity or you don't switch ethnicities by will, right? It's something that's inherited and so something that's culturally bound. So, belonging to an ethnic group can be decided. You can choose your religion, you can choose your language, you can choose your geography. A lot of people think that ethnicity can be subjective. Um, if you say my ethnicity is Jewish, that could be something that is part of your background. And it's also something that you could choose, right? So some people would say, your ethnicity is subjective. Other people would say no, like even though, being Jewish is something that you could choose, it's also part of your identity. So a lot of people with this ethnic background, they would say, I don't, even if you're not a practicing believer, you're still Jewish or you're still part of this ethnic group. Ethnicity can be something that's um, very changeable and it reflects your sense of belonging. So I like this description. Two men, one English, another Scottish, arguing in a pub. The two traded insults based on the other's individual ethnic identity. A third man with an East Indian accent intervened, and the English and Scotsman then claimed solidarity as real British people, turning on a member of the British East Indian minority group. A Frenchman then walked into the foray, which caused the Englishman, Scotsman, and East Indian to claim solidarity as British and to carry on a well established tradition of hostility with France. And then an American stepped in, causing the Frenchmen and the British to merge into Europeans, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of see how ethnicity is a formation based on differences between people, right? Or based on othering between two people. We relate in this way based on our ethnicity in relation to what we are not, right? So this can be a definition of ethnicity. People think of national identity as an extension of ethnicity. So a lot of people, if you ask them where they're from or what their ethnic background is, they'll say I'm American, right? And so this is kind of a part of a part of the reasoning that they have a shared language, a shared religion, a shared culture, history, and so this can also be a part of one's ethnic background. It could also be subjective, though. People can choose to form a nation together despite the differences in the above characteristics. People can, they can align whichever way, especially, immigrants who come to the United States. They can choose to identify with their home country, they can choose to identify with their host country. So these ways of belonging and these labels can be very different depending on who you're talking to. As far as like a nation state, there's an excellent book out there. I think his name is Benedict Anderson. He writes on imagined communities, and the sense that people feel like they need to create some sort of nation state in order to form an identity. And so, nation states can be autonomous, they can be centrally organized by a political entity. Um, and, whereas a nation, that qualifies a nation, ethnicities are not necessarily as formally organized. So, for example, you might have Laotian people from Laos, but you might also have a Hmong ethnicity, and they don't necessarily have a nation state to themselves, right? But they still can claim the ethnicity. So a lot of nation states have more than one ethnic group, and multi ethnicities are increasing along with immigration rates. And we see that to be true in the United States. So if you look at the map, you can see kind of the ancestries of ethnicities in the country. We see a lot of African Americans relegated to the South, and that from the history of enslaved Africans in our country. You can see that on the map. You see a lot of British settlement from the colonies. You'll see a lot of German migration, right? And so some of these you can still see a lots of Mexican or Spanish, immigration. You can still see some of them. Not just not picture, but it says you can see Chinese, a lot of Chinese people in San Francisco and New York, and parts in the northern country. You can see some Scandinavian roots, and you can see that in the number of restaurants and the number of heritage sites and folk festivals that you'll see around America that really cherishes the kinds of ethnicities in the area. That also relates very well to the dialect map. So the map before and the map here shows kind of the characteristics, right? So there's a book out there called American Nations, and the author Colin Woodward, he talks about how the United States is split into not 50 states but actually 12 nations. And he kind of talks a little bit about how there's different dialects depending on what are the 12 nations of the United States, and those map on to movements of migration from those areas. So, for example, where we are in the Mid-Atlantic, there's lots of Scots, Irish. There's lots of Polish settlement. There's lots of German settlement, right? And so those heritages are still in place today. We see them in a lot of street signs. We see them in the last names of people who are from Baltimore. We see a lot of migration from the South to Baltimore from African Americans. And so that is still, these people bring with them their languages and their different dialects, and that creates kind of clusters of dialect maps that we see here. We see also some ethnic clashes. So, for example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there's a competition to dominate nationality. We see a division of ethnicity across multiple states. For example, Kurds. So there's, Kurds in Turkey that try to say that we have a stake, right? We would like our own independent nation, or our own kind of independent um, kind of sense of recognition, right, for our ethnicity. And so some of the causes that lead to these ethnic clashes often are a legacy of colonialism. I don't know if you've ever, really watched the beginning of the Vietnam War, but kind of those colonialist traditions kind of led up to, um, some of the clashes between borders and between different groups. They could be a result of previous wars and empires. They could be causes of strong immigration of a different ethnicity or ethnic identity. And there can also be internal challenges of ethnic identification. We'll learn a little bit more later about how, certain regimes will try to squash certain ethnic groups by first destroying their language. because language is so closely tied to ethnic identity. So, as far as ethnicity goes, ethnicity could be race. Ethnicity could also be a PC term for race. Ethnicity, some people say that ethnicity is cultural, whereas race is biological. And so that really kind of separates the differences where you could be of a certain race, but also of a different ethnicity. And so there's various ethnolects. So when we talk about ethnolects, we're talking about ethnic dialects. And remember, dialects are just a way of speaking. There's nothing wrong about them. They're not aberrant in any kind. They're not, they're not lower than any sort of standard languages, right? They just, as Max Weinberg would say, they would have army and a navy, right? Languages would have an army and navy, whereas dialects would not. So there's a sense of power behind them. But we see a lot of various ethnolects. I'm sure, if you go to Little Italy in Baltimore, you probably see some of the Italian English, some of the roots that you'll see, in New York, for example. You'll see lots of Jewish English, Irish English in Boston, German English, Puerto Rican English, Chicano English, American Indian English, Vietnamese, Chinese, Cajun, right? So there's various ethnolects around the United States. For the purpose of this lecture, I only focus on a handful, but just to get your appetite whet with some of the features of ethnolects. And if you're interested in any, think about posting this on the discussion board. Think about writing it for your final paper. So, for example, if you identify as being Jewish American, you could definitely write a paper on being Jewish English. I highly recommend this movie, although it is a little bit outdated. I think it was made in the early 90s, but Do You Speak American? And it's just this narrator going around in different places of the United States. I think they interviewed Steve Harvey, and they talk about, what is it, how does your language relate to your identity, and what does it mean to be American? Is there a specific language or an ethnolect that really makes you into this American identity? And there's also another video I really recommend about linguistic profiling. So whereas the first video kind of gave an overview of, different dialects around the United States, the second one is a little bit more fine-tuned into the ways in which not all dialects are created equal. So a linguist, his name is John Ball, he goes around and he asks people on the phone whether or not there's a listing available in a certain, he wants to look at a property in a certain neighborhood. So he calls in various ethnolects just to see whether or not the property is available. And he found in his research that if he had, Chicano English, if he had a African American vernacular English, then they would be less likely to grant him to look at. They would say, "Oh, the property's already been, settled, or it's already been closed upon, or something like that." Whereas, where if you were able to use more standard features, um, they would say that, oh, the property is available. And it's also worth noting that John Ball is also African American identified. Um, so talking about African American English, this is the ethnolect of African Americans. Obviously, when we talk about ethnolect, this is a very broad term. This is not deterministic. Does not mean that all African Americans speak this way, right? So it's been called AAVE, African American Vernacular English, Black American English. A lot of people call it Ebonics, although that term is kind of outdated now. And is originally spoken in southern United States and West Africa. And there's multiple theories as to how African American English got started. A lot of people believe that the enslaved Africans that were brought over, spoke various creoles and dialects of their languages, and so they had to, kind of formulate a language, by themselves. And then another theory also states that they had to develop this English to be used by the plantation owners. It's very similar to Southern English. There's lots of commonalities. There's also lots of differences. Is this a Creole? A Creole is a language that is, kind of a mixture of different languages, but it's also something that's being spoken by the second generation as its native language. Because it is a variant of English spoken throughout the South, but it comprises of very diverse characteristics. So, just to test knowledge of habitual B, so this is found in African American English. Some people say this is changing. Some people say Baltimoreans, Black Baltimoreans don't say this, right? But this is a variety that linguists found early on in their study. So, what sounds grammatical, aka what sounds more right to you? Not in like a dictionary sense, but as in like if someone was talking to you, you would say, yes, that sounds correct. They usually be tired when they come home, or they be tired right now. When she play basketball, she be on my team, or that girl in the picture be my sister. My ankle be broken from the fall, or sometimes my ears be itching. So they did this study with lots of African American, I think fourth graders, and the the African American fourth graders were able to pick out every single time this term for habitual B. So the correct answer is they usually be tired when they come home. When she play basketball, she be on my team, and sometimes my ears be itching. So the rule here found in African American English is that you use the word be to determine habitual or something that's a habit, aka something that is reoccurring instance. You don't say, for example, I be going to the grocery store right now, right? Because this is something that's a one-time event and not something that's reoccurring. So there's lots of morphosyntactic features like copula deletion, right? So copula is like is or are. So you in AAE you'd say things like he late instead of he is late, or they running like um, instead of they are running. So a lot of people, if you're from the South, you would use the words like he late, but you would not use they running. That's something that's particular to African Americans. Habitual B I mentioned before for characteristics that are generally true of someone or something. So, for example, Sarah don't usually be there, or John be late means that he's usually running late. Negative concord. This is it as an existential expletive. So lots of AAE speakers will say it's a man at the door versus there's a man at the door. There's some morphological features. So instead of saying John's hat or Jack's car, someone can express possessive features by saying John hat or Jack car. Absence of third person singular present tense morpheme, them as a demonstrative, and ain't and many negation context. So instead of using, there isn't any more milk, you would say there ain't no more milk. African Americans also have phonological features such as fewer dental fricatives. So instead of saying this, they'll say dis. Fewer velar nasals, especially in ing forms. So that's, for example, I'm going running instead of I'm going running. And diphthong reduction. So instead of rice, you'll say rice. And again, you'll see a lot of this, especially the last two in Southern English. You'll see a lot of Southerners say rice, and you'll see a lot of people say I'm running today instead of running. So when we talk about grammar, when we talk about ethnolex, right, we want to say that these ethnic varieties all have different rules, and they may or may not. One speaker of AAE may not use all the rules, and these rules might be very different regionally, right? But there is some sort of irony or kind of like hilarity when people who are not used to the dialect try to use it. So for example, there's Twitter, very popular on Black Twitter, that tracks the cringiest use of Black language. So for example, they'll say things like "fam AF," right? Or some of these terms, some of these they call them slang, but some of these new variant forms often have African American origins, right? So If someone says, "We finna pop TF with this news," we're so sorry, but we're way too excited. That doesn't really make sense to someone who uses this language authentically, right? The University of Limerick came out and said, "Okay, T, if there's new lingo on Twitter that you don't understand, just let us know, fam. What's lit is that once a uni starts using it in tweets, it's canceled. Thank you, next. We stand you, but you've been new. We appreciate this is an odd flex, but sometimes it be that way. Hashtag big mood." So I think that this person is trying to put as many slang terms as they can, and it doesn't make any sense. And actually, it is the most cringe. Like, that was painful to read. And here's some others from the Twitter account. Adam Scott says, "I'm trying to get simp going as an abbreviation of simple. Check it out. Bill Nye lays out mask wearing in a super simp way." Mikey's turning 18. That's fam AF right there. PETA says that vegan life energy will have you shooketh in the best way. This person says, "No one's mad, sis. Chill." I think they're trying to say child, chill, but they're saying child or chile. I don't know. The wig is skinny, sis. You lit rally snap the tea. That's on period. Period. Sorry. Um. So yeah. So I think a lot of people, when they don't use language in authentic context, they really sound off, right? You can really tell when this isn't part of their language. And the same thing for AAE. When you use certain terms and it's not grammatical to the language, then it sounds like this. It sounds like you're trying very hard and failing. So Chicano English is an ethnoleg spoken primarily by Mexican Americans in southwestern United States, particularly California. Chicano English has lots of great influence from many linguistic features. It has a rhythm of Spanish with some syllables of relatively equal length. T and D deletion at the ends of words and devoicing of voice fricatives. So things like easy, right, was would be pronounced as easy. So Chicano English, one thing that you should know is that it has a very long tradition. And I highly recommend that you watch this video. It's a 2-minute video of a speaker of Chicano English. He lives in LA. And he kind of goes an overview of saying, Chicano English is older, with the exception of some Native American dialects, older than a lot of the languages in California. And, a lot of people say that Chicano English is just code switching, but it's not, right? Chicano English is a dialect for people who understand English. A lot of people think that they're ESL, or they don't speak English that well, or it's broken English, but it is a dialect that they speak just like African American English, just like Standard American English. So it's very important to know that Chicano English is not Spanglish. It's not code switching. It's used by speakers who speak both languages. It's also used as an identity marker, right? And then a lot of people also, from both English and Spanish speakers, they think of it as kind of this hybrid. And so they don't, from both sides, they don't really like it, right? It's often stigmatized. So English speakers would say, it sounds like you're code switching, or it sounds like Spanglish. And Spanish speakers would say, it's not authentic to the language. It's important to note that Chicano English speakers don't all speak Spanish, and it's not spoken by all Hispanic Americans. So you can compare this with the New Yorican, so it's New York Latino English, and there's lots of different varieties of Latino English as well. I like this quote from Santa Ana. She says, "Chicago English is an ethnic dialect that children acquire as they acquire English in the barrio or other ethnic social settings during their language acquisition period. Chicano English is to be distinguished from English of second language learners, thus defined Chicano English is spoken only by native English speakers." So again, Chicano English is nothing, it's not like they don't understand English. And a lot of people think they're ESL, but a lot of them actually don't speak Spanish fluently, right? So it's a separate dialect. Lumbee English. Lumbee English is the largest non-reservation Native American group in the United States. And one thing about Lumbee is that it is um, multi-ethnic. So it is, you can be a Lumbee, part of the Lumbee Native American tribe. And being Native American, you could be European American, you could be African American. And some people kind of have these mixtures of different identities, which creates for fascinating English. So they'll use words like, or the phrases, sorry, like I'm been there for I've been there. Um, they'll use I'm forgot for I forgot. They'll have finite be, so they'll say that's how it be sometimes. So, this is kind of converging with the habitual be that we talked about earlier. They'll have a regularized weren't. So, for example, they'll say, I weren't there, she weren't there. For I wasn't there, she wasn't there. So this is kind of a coastal regional a feature, sorry, in North Carolina. So there's a lot of Lumbee English has a really diverse set of what's called donor language sources. So it kind of um, picks and chooses from these different regional and different ethnolects to kind of create its own combination. And it's also locally situated. It's biracial, and it is a language that comprises of its multiracial background, and also comprises of patterns of segregation and population density. Um, my master's thesis advisor, he studied Lumbee English, and he said it was very different from Appalachian English and some of the Cherokee, because Lumbee English kind of derived from a sense of them losing their native tribal language, and so they had to kind of create a dialect within their own communities. Asian American ethnolinguistic repertoire. So I want to caveat before I give some examples of Asian American English is that the term Asian American English is a very vast, comprises a very vast group. You're talking anywhere from people who have ethnic identities, cultural identities from China or Korea or Japan or Cambodia or Laos or they could be stateless, they could be Hmong, they could be from India, they could be from North India, South India. So to use the term, Asian American, it's something that's very contested because it just comprises such of a big group. They can be Hawaiian or from the islands, right? So, when linguists set out to look at things like, what groups that you should look at, what variables you should investigate, what are some regional dialect features that contrast, it's very hard to kind of come up with this, with a summary of saying, oh, this is how Asian Americans speak because it's just such a diverse group. Um, and it's the fastest growing minority group in the United States, right? So, um, you know, except for clusters in New York City and in San Francisco, there isn't really, you'll see a lot of Asian Americans in different pockets of the United States, but it doesn't have this like rich cultural history of being together in one place and speaking in a particular language, with the exception of California, with lots of Chinese migration since the early 1800s, and then Japanese Americans, and Hawaiians. So this is a very contested. It's very difficult to do research on Asian Americans with such a vast, diverse group. Nevertheless, Ballman, he looked at the variable O in Mid-Atlantic Asian Americans versus white female college students from Mid-Atlantic. So, that's us. And he discovered that Asian Americans were more likely to show less movement. So, for example, instead of using, here's an indication of like, O fronting. Well, they'll say, boat. So when you say the words boat, your tongue actually moves forward and creates like a O sound. So it's actually more of a diphthong, right? So you'll say boat. But they'll say, so Ballman and a lot of other scholars recognize that Asian Americans had less movement. So they'll say boat. Um, And, that could be an interlanguage. That could be something that is a feature of, uh, Asian Americans who've maybe grown up in the United States. They still retain languages of their cultural heritage. Rays looked at the variable ite and nami in Southeast Asian Americans in high school in Philadelphia, and they saw that the practices, the Southeast Asian Americans were more likely to use patterns associated with African American youth culture to kind of create their in Asian Americanness. So they'll use a hybrid of African American English and some features of Vietnamese, Khmer, and Lao. And the author really talked about how, these Asian youth are using AA slang to kind of fashion an identity that's saying we're other Asians. Um, we're not Asians that associate with quote unquote the model minority. We have our own ethnic group, and they're able to kind of encompass a lot of the AAVE that they see in their peers. Shankar in 2008, he looked at Desi teens in the Bay Area, and he found that there was an opposition between FOB and the popular Desi identities. So FOB, a lot of people, are familiar with this term. It could be considered, non-PC, but it stands for fresh off the boat. So this is kind of someone who, didn't grow up in America, whereas someone who's, versus someone who's probably born in America. And Shankar looked at the use of Punjabi English code switching in these Desi accented English used by FOB males to distinguish themselves from the popular Desi teens, whereas the popular Desi teens use a lot of the hip hop language and the California slang. So again, language is something that people can use to index their ethnic identity. And it's also interesting to look at the ways in which language is represented on TV. I'm just going to use mock Asian as an example. So a lot of Asian American language uh, on television and on media sources, they displays Asians as being very heavily accented, kind of perpetuating a stereotype of a forever foreigner, in which it doesn't matter how long you've been in the United States, you're still a foreigner. Chinese is seen as this distant or exotic language, right? It's impossible to learn, it's difficult to learn. Um, Elaine Chun, she's a linguist in South Carolina. She looks at the ways in which people use mock Asian. So, for example, Ching Chong or Ting Tong or Ling Long, like, she looks at the ways in which other people try to imitate Asian speech. And then a lot of people say it's indecipherable. I remember my master's advisor, he was sitting in the hallway and he heard someone say, "Oh, Asians make sounds that don't exist," right? And so he was like, "What does that mean?" He's a linguist. So he's like, "What does that mean? Asians make sounds that don't exist, right? If they didn't exist, you won't be able to hear them." But I thought that was very interesting that this is not only represented in the media but also represented in real life. So features of mock Asian, neutralization of the phoneme between R and W's and R's and L's. So for example, wrong pronounced as wong or fried rice pronounced as fly lice. Voiceless interjectal fricative, th to s. So thank you is thank you. And then a lot of this kind of like intonational contour, like ching chong, like it's very song like, right? Reduplication of the word, everything ends in an E. And some of these have some historical qualities. So, for example, if you took my MLL 190 class, you learned a lot about the pigeons and creoles. And one of the pigeons was the Chinese English pigeon, right? The Chinese pigeon that the English traders had when they came to China and tried to trade their goods, right? And they came up with this like language that kind of encompass both aspects of Chinese and of English. And you would see these different things, but This is very interesting to see the ways in which mock Asian is represented, or how people who don't speak any Asian languages try to represent what these languages sound like. So, research again on Asian American language practices, they'll see that some of the syntactic features are absence of copula, tense neutralization, absence of articles, maybe using the wrong article, as I mentioned in previous lecture about how Chinese has an epicene, their lack of gender marking in pronouns. So it could be the use of the wrong pronoun. We see things like monophthongization, right? The O backing that we saw earlier, bilabial dentization. So these are some things that people see. We see in Japanese, there's not an L allophone, right? So they would use like an R instead. Um, so we would see that represented sometimes in media. But the use of Asian Englishes are rising. There's not a lot of research to the same extent as some of the other ethnolex, but it's very closely tied to identity. And it doesn't really address the fact that a lot of second and third multiple generations of Asian Americans are also not able to speak their cultural language. And so this represented in the media. This would be a very interesting discussion question or paper research question to see whether or not they do, especially in looking at some implications for Asian American speech. So, Asian immigrants with strong Asian accents are more subject to discrimination. Bauman, the same linguist from earlier, looked at Asian accented English, Brazilian Portuguese, mainstream US English, and found that there was a specific negative evaluation. Other studies have seen this as well, in which like a British accent or a Spanish accent would be considered sexy, whereas like a Asian accent would not, right? As far as people's perceptions. Libby Green found that students associate an Asian accent with an Asian instructor compared with to a white instructor, even when playing the same recording. So, if you haven't realized by now, I'm Asian. So, if you find that I have a very, Asian accent, this could be, there is precedence for this in research. And then also, code switching is something that's very common in a lot of the different languages. Code switching is linguistically structured. It's not a sign of linguistic deficiency. It actually means that you're able to speak different languages. And then, this is also conveyed in art, in that rapper Jin uses code switching as a purposeful art form. So these are some TV shows, starring Asian Americans, and so it'd be very interesting to see, what are the portrayals of Asian Americans? Do they represent the Asian Englishes that are found in linguistics and the research? Do they represent code switching? Do they represent stereotypes? Do they represent language loss? Right, this is something that's a pressing linguistic issue in the community, and it'd be very interesting to see whether or not these shows actually address that or not. So why do we study ethnolex? Kind of gave you some examples. It's kind of it really does identify people, and how people really have this group membership, this sense of belonging based on their ethnicity. And so language kind of reveals a little bit about that. It's a very important marker of who they are. Most ethnic groups believe that their language is the best way to preserve and protect their ethnic identity. There's also a form of prestige, right? So if you come into an ethnic community and you speak a certain way, there is a sort of prestige. Whereas if you're an outsider and you don't speak that language, there is something to be said, right? There's also forms of authenticity. So ethnolect is maintained through pressures by kin, by friendship, by a community. It could be. This is partly an explanation of saying why, even though African Americans can learn standard English, there is a certain authentic quality to speaking African American English, and to be able to get rid of that is seen as an attack on their values, their history, their social identity. And AAE also has covert prestige in the community. Being able to understand the language and not use it in these weird, ridiculous terms like the tweets I shared earlier, right? It's kind of like it's a marker of that you belong to this group. So crossing is something that's very contested because crossing is used by it's a language used by someone who isn't thought to belong to the speaker, and it must be approved by others. So a lot of people may use a certain language, um, very different from code switching. It's like you're a member of a different ethnic group and you crossed and used this other language. So it can be risky, and if not the if done inappropriately, um, it's actually can be very offensive. So I'm very curious to think about crossing because I haven't really seen good instances of crossing that weren't pejorative in any way. So it'd be very interesting to see the ways in which people use linguistic crossing because it very much borders on appropriation. So in the past, we've seen instances. Rachel Dolezal was a white woman who said she was African American for a number of years. Hilaria Baldwin, she um, claimed that she was Spanish for many, many years, and then it turns out she was from Boston. And then Jessica Krug, she's an associate professor, and she claimed that she is white and is not black, even though she kind of profited off of being black for many years. You'll see a lot of this, a lot of people who will say that they're who will cross into other languages. But what is the difference between crossing and appropriation? I'm very, very curious. Please share your ideas on the discussion board. So here's some discussion questions. What is ethnicity? Do you identify with an ethnic group? Is the ethnicity objective or subjective? Is your ethnicity reflected in the language that you use? Do you code switch? What linguistic feature do you notice about your ethnic group or other ethnic groups? Have you ever heard someone speak like a member of an ethnic group they weren't part of? Is it okay to cross? Is it appropriate? A language that is not your own, right? Um, and how are ethnolects portrayed in the media? So those would be some good discussion questions when we talk about language and ethnicity.